Did you ever notice how the model minority myth is only ever weaponized in one direction to harm black people? When black people are being compared to Asian Americans, then the hard work ethic and the emphasis on education are values that Asian Americans possess that black people need to aspire to. But when white people are compared to Asian Americans, suddenly those same values are described as toxic. Black parents are told that they need to put more emphasis on education and discipline the way Asian American parents do, but with respect to white parents, suddenly Asian Americans are abusive, authoritarian tiger parents. And black students are told that they need to study harder the way Asian American students do, but with respect to white students, suddenly it's unfair that they have to compete with the overachieving, nerdy Asian American students who lack social skills and were raised by the abusive, authoritarian tiger parents. And this is because the model minority myth is not something that was invented by Europeans about Asians. It is something that was invented in the United States about Asian Americans so that the United States could rehabilitate its reputation after the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II and to justify continued discrimination against black people. Because according to the model minority myth, what black people do is never enough, and what Asian Americans do is too much, because we live by a standard of just white. It's still AAPI History Month, so I would appreciate it if you could refrain from weaponizing Asian Americans to make negative implications about other races for at least another 10 days. I would prefer if you stopped altogether because I am not your model minority. Speaking of which, the model minority myth, which is what you're pushing, is exactly that. It's a myth. There is so much content available right here on TikTok by Asian American creators explaining that you have to disaggregate the data. And I don't feel like doing this labor again for you, so I'm going to break it down really quickly. The Asian American identity is comprised of dozens of ethnicities, and Asian Americans in the United States also have the largest wealth gap of any other race, with the highest income households earning approximately 11 times as much as the lowest income households. As shown here, the median household income of Indian, Taiwanese, and Filipino Americans skews the median household incomes of Asian Americans very high, and it should be no surprise that the Asian American ethnicities with high income correlates to high percentage of bachelor's degree, whereas the ethnicities with lower income correlates to lower percentage of bachelor's degrees, because Asian Americans are affected by lack of access to resources just the same as other races. Asian Americans are not some magical group of people that prove that you can spin straw into gold. Now, there is also a strong correlation between the top earning Asian American ethnicities and those who receive H-1B visas. And this is particularly apparent with Indians, who are the top earning Asian American ethnicity and also account for 75% of H-1B visas. And the reason why the United States has that immigration policy is because companies can pay highly skilled employees who receive H-1B visas less than they would have to pay their non-immigrant counterparts. Another thing is that the model minority myth was created on East Asians, Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans in particular, because those are groups that faced a significant and long history of oppression in the United States. The idea being that despite being oppressed, those groups stay quiet, they don't protest, they work hard, they study hard, and they're able to get into good schools and get a good job and accumulate wealth in one generation. They're able to lift themselves up by their bootstraps and prove that the American dream is true, the counterpoint being if other historically oppressed groups in the United States are not able to accomplish the same thing, the problem isn't with the United States, but is with the cultural values of those groups. But as the data shows, the Asian Americans who are doing best in the United States are not the Asian Americans that the model minority myth was created on. And this is because the myth takes the success of some Asian Americans and treats it as belonging to other Asian Americans in order to hide their struggles. For example, the rate of poverty among Chinese American elderly in New York City is on the rise. So once you contextualize and disaggregate the data that contributes to the model minority myth, it does unravel. This is an important question because not acknowledging the answer perpetuates the model minority myth. But first, it doesn't do to minimize that British and American merchants tried to reproduce the transatlantic slave trade on the Pacific, specifically with Asian men, because we still see disparate treatment between Asian American men and Asian American women persist to this day. And it's an important part of understanding that Asian men were viewed as disposable property for labor. What changed for Asian Americans in the 1960s with the United States opening the door to Asian immigration is that Asian countries were gaining in political and economic strength. The United States couldn't afford to keep the door closed to Asian immigration nor to continue mistreating Asian Americans. So barriers that had been put in the way of Asian Americans to prevent them from thriving, some of them were removed. And I'm not saying that Asian Americans don't work hard and that there aren't values that lend themselves to academic success. Good schooling can lead to getting a good job. Getting a good job can help you accumulate wealth. But we know in the United States that barriers are put in the way of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color to prevent them from thriving. I'm not saying that the barriers are the same or to the same degree, but there are similarities. It doesn't matter how hard you study if you don't have access to good education. It doesn't matter what degree you have if you're shut out of the labor market. And it doesn't matter how hard you work at the job that you have if there are laws and structures in place that prevent you from accumulating wealth. And if we perpetuate this idea that there are no barriers put in anybody's way and Asian Americans are proof that anybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps in one generation, we are marginalizing all Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color, including Asian Americans. What are we saying about our Asian American forebears? That the railroad workers struggled because they didn't work hard enough? That Southeast Asian demographics that are experiencing high rates of poverty don't work hard enough? For them, their high school dropout rates, suicide rates, and life expectancy are on par with that of Black and Indigenous people. And in New York City, poverty is increasing for Asian Americans, including East Asian elderly. So what are you saying about the East Asian elderly in New York City? That they let go of their bootstraps, or were their bootstraps cut? Let's take a look at weaponized positionality of Asian Americans with respect to the hate crime bill. Asian Americans, raise your hand if you at least think that Biden is the lesser of two evils. Raise your hand if you think that a president who at least acknowledges anti-Asian hate crimes is better than a president who instigates them. Raise your hand if you support BLM. Raise your hand if you think that our current policing system is unfair and you support mass reform. Raise your hand if you wanted to be used as a tool to fund the police against the Black community. Not so much with that last one, but that's what happened with the hate crime bill. When the hate crime bill was announced, what most people heard was that the president was putting money where his mouth was where it comes to protecting Asian lives. The message that some heard was that the president was making a performative gesture in order to appear as though he cares about Asian lives, when the plan is actually to say that the matter has been taken care of and sweep it under the rug. The reality is, the president allocated funds to fund the police. Now, if the president had funded the police department in order to investigate and prosecute hate crimes against minorities, that would be a step in the right direction indeed. But since when has the government ever funded the police in order to prosecute crimes that mostly white people are committing? And now, if you add this to the active disinformation campaign that is making it seem as though it's a majority Black people who are committing anti-Asian hate crimes, the picture becomes pretty clear. And this is why communities need to join together in solidarity, because we need to be able to put all of these pieces together and call it out as a unified community to challenge the status quo. That is the only way that change is going to happen. So clearly this question is not being asked in good faith. However, considering the video that it came from, it's also likely that the question I answered was not asked in good faith, and this question is merely mirroring that sentiment. As for the original video, as an Asian American, I can't speak for all Asian Americans, but I do feel that it's my responsibility to acknowledge and hold myself accountable for, and people like me accountable for, the harms that our racial prejudice has done to other people. Extending that logic to this question, it is not for me to answer. But I am going to use the opportunity to speak again on the weaponized positionality of Asian Americans and the harm that's done to the Black community and why I understand the resentment that that may have bred. Again, using the time frame of the 1960s and the civil rights movement and new wave Asian immigration. So it's important for us to remember that in 1964, the Civil Rights Amendment had just been passed. This is what Black people had been fighting and dying for. And it paved the way for civil rights for all of us. And then in 1965, the United States opened the door to Asian immigration. So now you have a wave of Asian immigrants arriving into the United States, bringing with them a spectrum of whatever racial prejudice and anti-Black sentiment they may have received in their home countries, and arriving and not acknowledging that our civil rights that we arrived with were thanks to the Black community. We did not arrive saying, thank you for our civil rights. How can we help you? How can we help you achieve equity in your structure? We arrived with the civil rights and then were preoccupied with creating lives of our own. And in doing so, we were supplanting the equity and the opportunities that the Black community had been fighting for and was supposed to be receiving. And as I've said before, the United States didn't open the door to immigration because they wanted Asians here and because they cared about Asians. They needed to improve their global reputation as Asian countries rose to power. They wanted access to the most educated Asian students, and they wanted a source of cheap labor so that they would not have to pay Black people fair wages. So, and then all of a sudden, too, Asian Americans were opening businesses in the Black communities that Black people wanted to be opening for themselves. So, all of these things, coupled with the fact that we are all capable of having racial prejudice, that we all buy into negative stereotypes from the media, that we are all manipulated by disinformation about one another on top of the weaponized positionality, it's understandable why that breeds resentment. I want to talk about the model minority myth and how treating Asian Americans as a monolith in accordance with the myth marginalizes Asian Americans who don't fit the model. I'm a fairly stereotypical model minority. I'm of East Asian descent. I'm first generation American born, and I have a relatively light complexion by US standards. Some people have asked me about colorism in Asia. Yes, that does exist. So my father's family were Sino-Japanese War refugees, and he grew up in a significant amount of poverty, but he had access to excellent public education. So he did work hard, and he graduated top of his high school class and was able to attend the best university and worked hard and graduated the top of his university class. So he came to the United States in the 1960s on a student visa to attend a PhD program at an Ivy League school. And upon completion of that program, he had access to excellent research jobs. And by the time I was born, my parents were pretty financially stable. They were able to buy their first house, and that was paid off before I graduated from high school. But the important thing to remember is that my dad's experience, and by extension my experience, is actually quite rare, even though we get upheld as the norm for Asian Americans in the United States. By contrast, my mom came to the United States in the 1950s with refugee status. And for her, when she arrived, housing, education, and job opportunities were much more limited. And I think that had she not married my dad, achieving financial stability in one generation would have been much harder, if not impossible. And she worked just as hard as my dad, if not harder, of course. But I think that her experience is a little more typical of East Asian Americans. So the thing about the model minority myth with respect to people of East Asian descent is that it basically makes invisible people who don't fit the model, people who don't have access to higher education, who are not in a certain socioeconomic class. The model minority myth basically says that they don't exist. That is all people like me. And then the other thing that does is marginalize South Asians and Southeast Asians. It completely makes invisible both their successes and the struggles that they face. So what the model minority myth does to the Asian American community is that people like me are given a fairly high amount of conditional white privilege because it's easy for me to assimilate, while others are left nearly invisible in society with no recognition to their successes or to their struggles. And this is why it's important for all Asian Americans to work against perpetuating that myth. I've seen some videos by Black male content creators recently along the lines of if we responded to our oppression the way the Jews did, there would be Black Wall Streets everywhere, and saying that it's a problem with Black culture, that they're not doing whatever it is that poor Asian American families do that allow their children to achieve academic success despite lack of access to resource. And although these videos might be solution-oriented in spirit, what are other communities doing and can we adopt those practices to better our circumstances, it feels like internalized racism and victim blaming. And although they may think that they're talking about these other communities in a positive light, it's perpetuating stereotypes that harm those communities as well as Black communities. And I feel like this is a way in which white supremacy enforces itself even when no white people are involved. Stereotypes aren't created to uplift. They're created to erase culture, to create division, and to assign blame. And what we as our various communities really need to be doing is coming together to dismantle those stereotypes and dismantle white supremacy. So if you're thinking, what are virtues in Jewish culture that I can adopt, and your mind immediately goes to Wall Street, you're playing into the stereotype of the Jewish banker, that Jews control the banks and medias, and we're seeing right now in all sorts of ways how that's incredibly harmful. It's also discounting that Black Wall Street was a real thing. Black people's response to their oppression was to create a community for themselves that had wealth and success and access to resource and created school systems for their children, and it was destroyed by white people. If Black communities weren't being destroyed by white people, there would be Black Wall Streets everywhere. The model minority myth conflates the struggles experienced by marginalized Asian Americans, typically Southeast Asians, with the success of Asians who have been given a lot of privilege and proximity to whiteness, typically East Asians. And treating Asians as a monolith erases their culture and creates this fiction that Asians can experience having their countries destroyed by colonization, can come to America and be completely excluded, can be the victims of racism, and can be experiencing poverty, but their work ethic, their silence, their obedience, will raise children that will still succeed. They can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And that's harmful to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, because it's saying if you can't pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, it's not a problem with white supremacy because they were able to do it. So clearly the problem is yours. So by all means, communities need to come together and be learning from each other, but we need to be learning from each other how to dismantle white supremacy because it's going to take all of us.
In New York City, Asians are the poorest people in New York City, demographic-wise. They have lower levels of violence than any other demographic. They have the highest test scores than any other demographic. They go to specialized schools at higher rates than any other demographic. If it was a resource problem, how do you explain that?
Okay, well, we need to find a better way to get kids to want to be engaged with these resources.
Okay.
I think maybe that is the problem.
And so that is culture.
First of all, no racial group is a monolith. There are Asians who study hard, there are Asians who don't. There are Black people who study hard, and there are Black people who don't. And second of all, can we take a step back and recognize how ridiculous it is to compare racial groups in a country that have completely different backgrounds and histories? But in the US, among high selectivity immigrants, African immigrants actually have a higher education level than East Asian immigrants, and in particular Nigerian immigrants have a higher education level than Chinese and South Korean immigrants. So it has nothing to do with Asian or Black. But do you know why we started comparing Asians and Black people in the United States? It's because in the 1950s and 60s, when the United States was engaging in military actions in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, bringing democracy to Asia and fighting against communism, as the civil rights movement gained in momentum and attention, people around the world started wondering, with all of the racism and injustice in the United States, who are Americans to go to any other country and tell them how to be? So the United States said, no, Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans are being great. You can look, they're not protesting. They're quiet, they're working hard, they're living their lives, and they're doing fine. The problem is the loud, angry, protesting Black people. And do you notice how the model minority myth only ever goes in one direction to make Black people look bad? Because let's take the model Asian who studies really hard. Do you know who else they're studying much harder than? white people. In 2021, among 18 to 24-year-olds, college enrollment among Asian Americans was 60%, among white people it was 38%, and among black people it was 37%. So among white and black people it was about the same. But struggling white people do not get told you would be doing better if you were more like Asian Americans with their strong family values and their emphasis on academics. As a matter of fact, when Asians get compared to white people, Asian success is an indication that Asians are stealing opportunities and resources from white people and that we don't belong here.